The story of Dorie Miller doesn't begin on a warship or in a battle. It begins in the quiet, sun-baked fields of Waco, Texas, a place where the days were long, the work was endless, and the dreams of young men were often buried beneath the dust of the Great Depression. Dorie was born in 1919, the third of four sons in a family of farmers. His parents worked from dawn till dusk, trying to squeeze life out of dry soil. From the moment he could walk, Dorie was helping his father plow, feed livestock, and haul water. He wasn't a boy who complained. He was a boy who endured. Hardship was his first teacher, and resilience was the lesson he learned early. He grew fast, tall, broad-shouldered, with a quiet strength that people noticed. In high school, he was a star fullback on the football team, a natural athlete with discipline to match his size. But the field could only take him so far. By the time Dorie graduated, the Great Depression had sunk its claws deep into America. Factories closed, fields dried up, and jobs vanished like morning mist. He watched older men, stronger, wiser, broken, wander the streets of Waco looking for work that didn't exist. His family scraped by, but barely. And for a young black man in Texas in the 1930s, even the faintest spark of ambition could feel like rebellion. He dreamed of more, of leaving the farm, seeing the world, doing something that mattered. But there were no real paths open to him. Society had already decided where he fit, behind a plow, not behind a wheel, serving others, not standing beside them. The doors to opportunity were not just closed. They were locked tight. Therefore, when he heard that the U.S. Navy was recruiting, he saw his chance. Not for glory, not even for adventure, but for survival. The Navy offered food, shelter, and a steady paycheck. It also offered something no one in Waco could give him: a way out. In September 1939, as the world braced for another great war, Dorie walked into a recruiting office and signed his name. He was just 20 years old, a farm boy who had never seen the ocean, now ready to serve on one of the most powerful fleets in the world. He didn't know it yet, but this decision would pull him into the heart of history. The journey that began with calloused hands on a Texas farm would end in the blazing chaos of Pearl Harbor. But before that, Dorie would have to face another battle, one not fought with bombs or bullets, but with the invisible walls of segregation that defined the Navy he was about to enter. Therefore, his fight for survival would soon become something much greater. A fight for recognition, respect, and equality inside an institution that didn't yet believe he deserved it. When Dorie put on the Navy uniform for the first time, he believed it meant something. Discipline, honor, equality. That's what the posters had promised. The uniform looked sharp, the ship life seemed orderly, and the idea of serving his country filled him with quiet pride. But that pride didn't last long. The reality of the Navy in 1939 was not the same for every man who wore its colors. For white sailors, the uniform opened doors to skills, promotions, and leadership. For black sailors like Dorie, it was a symbol of limitation. The Navy's policy was simple and cruel. African Americans could serve, but only in one way, as mess attendants. Their duty: cook the meals, shine the shoes, clean the cabins, carry the trays. They were not trained to fire guns, navigate ships, or command men. They were expected to serve, not to fight. The same uniform, the same flag, but two very different worlds. Dorie accepted his assignment as a mess attendant without protest. He knew better than to challenge the system. At least not yet. But inside, a quiet fire burned. He was strong, disciplined, and capable of much more than washing dishes and folding linens. His superiors noticed his size, over 6 feet tall, built like a linebacker, and they made him a ship's heavyweight boxing champion. In the ring, for a few brief minutes, he was equal to any man who faced him. Still, every victory inside the ropes ended when he stepped back into the galley. The Navy was a place of precision and order, but also of invisible walls. Black sailors couldn't rise above the rank of steward. They lived in separate quarters, ate in separate mess halls, and followed a separate set of expectations. Dorie saw the hypocrisy clearly. A navy that preached brotherhood at sea but practiced segregation below deck. And yet, he didn't complain. He learned every inch of his duties, worked harder than anyone asked, and carried himself with quiet dignity. His fellow sailors respected him. They could see the strength beneath his calm. He was stationed on the USS West Virginia, a massive battleship armed to the teeth, part of the proud Pacific Fleet. Life aboard was demanding but steady. The crew trained daily, the sea stretched endlessly, and the days blurred together. But while the Navy gave him structure, it also boxed him in, literally and figuratively. Every corridor reminded him that no matter how strong or skilled he became, he would never be allowed to stand on the bridge or hold a weapon in combat. Therefore, he learned to find meaning in small acts of excellence, folding uniforms with precision, keeping his section spotless, boxing with focus, waiting quietly, patiently, for a moment that might never come. That moment would arrive sooner than anyone could imagine. A few thousand miles from Texas, Dorie Miller's destiny waited on the calm waters of Pearl Harbor. On a quiet Sunday morning, he'd be below deck, doing what he always did: laundry, service, routine. But the sound that shattered that calm wasn't a whistle or a bell. It was the scream of bombs falling from the sky. Therefore, the man who was never trained to fight would soon become the one name the world could never forget. December 7th, 1941. A date that would carve itself into the heart of history. The morning began like any other on the USS West Virginia. The tropical air was warm, the sky over Pearl Harbor was calm and blue, and the crew moved through their routines without urgency. The harbor itself was peaceful, a floating city of steel and pride. Battleships lined in perfect order, engines silent, flags fluttering. Below deck, Dorie Miller was folding laundry in the ship's service area. The hum of the ship was comforting, familiar. He might have been thinking about home, about the fields of Waco, or about the boxing matches he'd soon compete in. Life aboard West Virginia was strict but predictable, and for a black mess attendant, predictability meant safety. But at 7:55 a.m., that calm shattered. A deep rumble thundered through the hull. Then another. The ship lurched violently as if struck by a giant's fist. Dorie froze for a split second. Then came the alarms. "General quarters!" "All hands, man your battle stations." At first, confusion, maybe a drill, but then came the unmistakable sound of chaos. The staccato rattle of machine guns, the shriek of dive bombers, the roar of explosions. The air filled with the smell of smoke and burning oil. The Japanese had launched a surprise attack. Dorie's assigned battle station was an ammunition magazine for the ship's anti-aircraft guns. He sprinted through the corridors. But when he arrived, the compartment was a ruin. Fire, twisted metal, and bodies where his crew should have been. His job, his one assigned role, was gone. Therefore, he had to make a choice: stay below deck and wait for orders, or act. He chose action. He pushed towards the upper decks, the sounds of chaos guiding him like a drumbeat. Explosions shook the ship. Every few seconds, the deck trembled beneath his boots. When he reached the open air, the sight stopped him cold. The sky was filled with planes, marked with red suns, diving toward the harbor. Torpedoes sliced through the water. Battleships burned one after another. The West Virginia had already been hit several times and was listing hard to port. Flames licked across the deck. Men screamed orders and names. Dorie didn't hesitate. He began hauling the wounded to safety. One of them was the ship's captain, Mervyn Bennion, who'd been struck by shrapnel. Dorie and another sailor carried him to a safer position near the conning tower, even as bombs continued to fall. His size, 6'3", over 200 pounds, made him a lifeline for men too weak to move on their own. For those moments, Dorie wasn't a mess attendant. He was the strongest man on that ship, moving through smoke and fire to save lives. But as he laid the captain down, something caught his eye. An unmanned .50 caliber anti-aircraft gun mounted on the deck, its barrel still smoking. The man who was supposed to be there was gone. No one had ever taught Dorie how to use it. Black sailors weren't trained on weapons, but the sky above him was alive with destruction. An instinct took over. Therefore, he stepped behind the gun, gripped the handles, and began to fire. He didn't think. He reacted. The weapon kicked against his arms, shell casings flew, smoke filled his lungs. He aimed at the planes, diving toward the ship, leading his shots just like he'd once learned to read opponents in the boxing ring. Each burst was defiance. Every shot said, "I am not what you think I am." 15 minutes passed, or maybe it was a lifetime. When the gun finally jammed and his ammunition ran dry, the harbor was unrecognizable. Battleships burned like torches. The West Virginia was sinking, her deck disappearing beneath the oily water. Dorie had fired until the last bullet, then helped more wounded sailors escape. But the attack wasn't just about ships. It was about awakening a nation. And among the countless faces that morning, one name would rise above the smoke. Therefore, the Navy's most unexpected hero, a man once told he could never fight, had just changed the story of Pearl Harbor forever. When the bombing finally stopped, silence didn't bring relief. It brought the sound of devastation. The water burned with oil, the air was thick with smoke, and cries for help echoed across the harbor. The USS West Virginia was sinking, her proud hull now a mangled silhouette against the flames. Dorie Miller stood among the wreckage, chest heaving, arms numb from the recoil of the gun he wasn't supposed to touch. Around him, the chaos had stilled. But inside, he was still fighting the disbelief of what he'd just done. He had manned a weapon without orders, without training, without permission, and turned it against the enemy. He didn't count how many planes he hit. He just kept firing until the ammunition was gone. Some say he downed 2 Japanese bombers. Others say it was more. Dorie himself would later say, quietly, "I think I got one of those planes." That was it. No bragging, no speeches, just a man who did what he thought needed to be done. When the West Virginia finally settled on the harbor floor, Dorie kept helping others, dragging the wounded, dousing fires, refusing to leave until the last man who could be saved was safe. Only then did he abandon ship. But even after the smoke cleared, the battle for recognition was just beginning. For most of the Navy's leadership, Dorie's actions were inconvenient. He had done something extraordinary, but he didn't fit the Navy's image of a hero. Black sailors weren't supposed to fight, much less shoot down enemy planes. The first official reports of the attack barely mentioned him. In fact, his name wasn't even known. He was referred to only as an unnamed Negro messman who handled a machine gun with great courage. Therefore, it fell to his crewmates, the men who saw him in action, to make sure his story wasn't erased. They wrote letters, gave testimonies, and demanded recognition for the sailor who had fought beside them while others froze in fear. Slowly, word began to spread. Newspapers picked up the story, calling him the Black Hero of Pearl Harbor. Civil rights groups joined the chorus, insisting the Navy honor him properly. It was no longer just about one man's courage. It was about the contradiction at the heart of America's war effort. How could a nation fight for freedom abroad while denying it at home? The pressure worked. Months later, the Navy could no longer ignore him. But instead of promoting him or giving him command, they gave him something symbolic: a medal, a recognition of bravery without changing the rules that kept men like him confined. Therefore, on May 27, 1942, aboard the USS Enterprise, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, the commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet, personally presented Dorie Miller with the Navy Cross. It was the third highest military honor available, and Dorie became the first African-American in history to receive it. Standing tall in his dress blues, surrounded by officers who once would have never shared a table with him, Dorie accepted the medal without a word of complaint or pride. He didn't need to. His actions had already spoken louder than any speech could. That photo of a tall black sailor shaking hands with one of the most powerful men in the Navy traveled across America. For black citizens, it was more than just a moment of pride. It was proof that courage had no color. For the Navy, it was a way to polish its image, to say, "See, we honor all who serve." But behind the smiles and ceremony, the institution didn't really change. Black sailors were still stuck in the same limited roles. Dorie's medal was an exception, not a new rule. The walls of segregation stood firm. Therefore, while America celebrated its new hero, Dorie went back to work. Still a mess attendant, still serving meals, still waiting for a Navy that would one day live up to its own ideals. He had become a symbol, but he was still a soldier. And soldiers, no matter how famous, go where they're ordered. His next assignment would send him into the thick of the Pacific once more. But this time, he wouldn't make it home. Therefore, his final act would not be one of battle, but of legacy, a story that would refuse to die even when he did. Smoke still curled from the decks of the West Virginia. The air reeked of burning oil, salt, and death. Yet amidst that chaos, Dorie Miller stood firm, sweat streaking his face, chest heaving, hands trembling but steadying as he gripped the handles of the .50 caliber Browning machine gun. He had never been trained to use it. Black sailors weren't allowed to. His job by regulation was to serve breakfast, not defend a battleship. But in that moment, rules no longer mattered. The sky was filled with planes marked with the red sun of Japan, diving and strafing with mechanical fury. His shipmates screamed for cover. The captain was wounded. The gunners were dead or dying. The West Virginia shuddered from torpedo hits. Therefore, Dorie did what instinct told him. He climbed onto the open deck, manned the unmanned gun, and began to fire. The machine roared to life, rattling his bones, shaking the railing beneath his feet. Tracer rounds sliced upward into the gray morning, cutting through smoke and sky alike. He tracked the planes as they came low and fast, the noise so loud he could barely hear his own voice shouting orders to no one. He fired at one dive bomber until it veered off trailing smoke, then another, then another. Sailors around him, white and black alike, stared in disbelief as the ship's cook laid down a curtain of fire. A petty officer nearby would later testify that Miller handled the gun as though he had done so all his life. Another claimed he saw Miller hit 2 enemy aircraft before they peeled away. The Navy would never confirm it officially, but to the men who watched, it didn't matter. He was their rock in the inferno. But heroism had its limits in that apocalypse. When the ammunition ran out, the ship was already sinking. Orders rang out to abandon the West Virginia. Miller helped drag the wounded, including the ship's captain, Mervyn Bennion, to safety, ignoring his own burns and exhaustion. The captain would die later from his wounds, but Dorie's efforts saved many others. The harbor was a graveyard now. Ships listing, fires raging, men jumping into oil-slicked water to survive. Above them, the sky still thundered with the enemy's fury. Therefore, Miller joined the lifeboat efforts, ferrying the injured to shore, refusing to rest even when the attacks ceased. He was one of the last to leave the ship, his once white uniform blackened by soot and gunpowder. When he finally reached the docks, he didn't celebrate. He didn't even speak. He just sat down, staring at the sea. The same sea that had been his prison and his proving ground. Word began to spread quickly through the ranks. A mess attendant shot down enemy planes. The story grew with every telling. Some called him reckless, others a miracle. His name started to echo through the Navy, whispered first, then shouted proudly, Dorie Miller. But official recognition didn't come immediately. The Navy had never faced this kind of story before. A black sailor performing one of the bravest acts of the war's beginning. The bureaucracy hesitated. Reporters were told only that an unnamed Negro sailor had shown exceptional valor. Therefore, Dorie went back to duty, quiet, humble, unchanged in demeanor, but marked forever by that morning. He still served coffee. He still cleaned cabins. Yet every man who passed him now stood a little straighter. They knew what he had done, and deep down he knew it too, though he never spoke of it unless asked. The world would learn his name soon enough. But for now, Pearl Harbor still smoldered, and Dorie Miller, the man who had never been allowed to fight, had just fired the first American shots in the Pacific War. When the smoke finally cleared over Pearl Harbor, America was no longer the same country. The newspapers screamed infamy and war, factories roared back to life, and young men across the nation lined up to enlist. The United States had been dragged into the global conflict it had long tried to avoid. And somewhere in the Pacific, one name was being quietly passed from sailor to sailor: the mess attendant who fought back. At first, the Navy didn't even bother to record his full identity. The initial reports simply said, a Negro messman displayed exceptional courage under fire, manning an anti-aircraft gun during the attack on Pearl Harbor. That was it. No name, no photo, just a shadow of a man behind a headline. But word has a way of finding light. The story reached the black press within weeks. The Pittsburgh Courier, one of the most influential African-American newspapers of the time, began to investigate. They spoke to sailors, survivors, witnesses. Slowly, a picture emerged. Tall, broad-shouldered from Waco, Texas. a cook who fired a gun when trained men had fallen. Therefore, by January 1942, the world finally knew his name, Dorie Miller. The story ignited something deeper than just admiration. For Black Americans, it became a symbol, living proof that patriotism and heroism weren't confined to one color. Churches prayed for him. Activists wrote editorials demanding recognition. Parents told their children about the cook who became a warrior. But inside the Navy, that recognition was complicated. Military hierarchy ran deep, and segregation was still official policy. Some officers worried that giving Miller too much attention might set a precedent. But the pressure grew. Public demand became impossible to ignore. The Pittsburgh Courier, the Chicago Defender, and civil rights leaders began a campaign demanding a medal for Dorie Miller, not just for him, but for every Black serviceman overlooked by history. Therefore, on May 27, 1942, in a ceremony aboard the aircraft carrier Enterprise, Dorie Miller was awarded the Navy Cross, the second highest military decoration in the United States. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz himself pinned the medal on his chest, saying, "This marks the first time in this conflict that such high tribute has come to a member of his race. He fought bravely and with distinction. It was a moment of history and contradiction." The Navy's highest brass stood before him, honoring a man who, by their own rules, should never have been in combat at all. Reporters took photos. Newspapers around the world printed his face. He was suddenly the hero who wasn't supposed to exist. But fame, as it often does, began to twist. While white war heroes were promoted, interviewed, and celebrated across the nation, Miller was sent back to service. Not as a symbol, not as a gunner, but again as a mess attendant. He had risked his life, fired a gun with deadly precision, and saved his shipmates. Yet the Navy still wouldn't let him train as a gunner. Therefore, when asked by reporters how he felt about his medal, Dorie smiled and said quietly, "I just tried to do my duty. When the time came, I guess I did what any man would do." His humility made him beloved. His courage made him unforgettable. But his continued service, still in the galley, still cleaning, still restricted, made him a symbol of America's unfinished promise. The Courier began calling for something more radical. Let Dorie Miller lead the fight to integrate the Navy. The movement grew, but progress was slow. Washington hesitated, bureaucrats stalled, and the old ways clung stubbornly to the new age. But for every obstacle, Dorie's story kept spreading. Schools recited it. Posters used his image to inspire war bonds. Black recruits joined the Navy because of him. He had become a legend in uniform, even if that uniform still carried chains of inequality. Therefore, when he was finally reassigned to the escort carrier Liscum Bay in 1943, Miller carried with him the weight of a people's pride and the burden of being a symbol larger than himself. He had survived Pearl Harbor. He had broken barriers without ever asking to. Yet the war wasn't done with him, not by a long shot. By late 1943, the tide of the war had shifted. America was striking back across the Pacific, island by island, wave by wave. The Japanese Navy that once seemed invincible was being pushed back, and men like Dorie Miller were now part of that unstoppable march toward victory. After months of service, Dorie was transferred to the escort carrier USS Liscum Bay, a smaller but vital ship responsible for supporting the island-hopping campaign. The carrier's job was to provide air cover and transport aircraft, not glamorous, but essential. For Dorie, it meant another chance to serve, another chapter in his journey. But beneath the calm discipline of military life, there was something uneasy about Liscombe Bay. It was a light carrier, lightly armored, fast, but dangerously vulnerable. Many of its crew whispered that if the ship ever took a direct hit, there'd be no time to escape. Therefore, the men worked quickly, efficiently, and quietly. No one said it out loud, but everyone knew. One lucky torpedo could end it all. On November 24th, 1943, just before dawn, that unspoken fear became reality. At 5:10 a.m., during operations near the Gilbert Islands, a Japanese submarine, I-175, found its mark. A single torpedo struck the Liscombe Bay near the bomb storage area. The explosion ripped through the ship like a monster awakening from the deep. In seconds, the carrier was engulfed in fire. The blast was so powerful it lifted the flight deck into the air. Witnesses later said the explosion looked like a giant flame swallowing the sea. Dorie was below deck when the torpedo hit, but even in chaos, those who knew him said he didn't panic. He had been through hell once before, at Pearl Harbor, and he knew the sound of disaster. Some survivors recalled seeing him helping men reach the upper decks, guiding the wounded through the smoke and debris. Therefore, while the fire consumed everything around him, Dorie kept doing what he'd always done, serving others before himself. Moments later, a second blast tore through the ship, then a third. The Liscombe Bay began to sink, taking with it more than 600 men. One of the worst naval disasters of the Pacific War. Only a few hundred survived. Dorie Miller was not among them. The Navy listed him as missing in action, and months later, presumed dead. He was just 24 years old, but even in death, his story refused to fade. News of his loss broke hearts across America. In Waco, Texas, his family received the telegram, the kind every parent dreaded during wartime. His mother, Henrietta, said quietly to a reporter, "He died doing his duty." That's all we can ask of any man. Therefore, the legend of Dorie Miller only grew stronger. He became the symbol of a generation's courage and the injustice they faced. His name was invoked in speeches calling for racial equality. Black newspapers declared him a martyr for freedom, not only from tyranny abroad, but from prejudice at home. The Navy might have lost a sailor, but America had gained an icon. But even so, decades would pass before the country fully recognized what he represented. Integration of the armed forces wouldn't come until 1948, 5 years after Dorie's death, when President Truman signed Executive Order 9981, officially desegregating the U.S. military. Therefore, when that order was signed, many said it was the spirit of men like Dorie Miller, brave, loyal, and forgotten, that made it possible. Years later, monuments would be built. Ships would be named in his honor. In 2020, the U.S. Navy announced a new aircraft carrier, the USS Dorie Miller, the first ever named after an African-American enlisted sailor. It was a tribute long overdue. Dorie Miller never sought fame. He never asked to be a hero. He just did what had to be done, again and again, even when the world told him he couldn't. But that's what makes legends. They don't rise because they want to. They rise because they must. Therefore, long after the last echoes of war faded, one truth remained. Courage doesn't care what color you are. When wars end, most heroes fade quietly into the history books. Their stories sealed behind medals, ceremonies, and old black and white photos. But Dorie Miller's legacy refused to stay silent. His courage had become something bigger than one man, one ship, or one battle. The world tried to move on, but America couldn't forget the cook who had turned a gun on the enemy at Pearl Harbor. But as decades passed, his name was often left out of mainstream war stories. Textbooks mentioned admirals and generals, presidents and policies. But Dorie's story, the story of a man who changed how the Navy saw itself, was often just a footnote. Therefore, communities across America, especially African American veterans, began keeping his memory alive in their own ways. Churches held remembrance services. Schools named halls after him. In his hometown of Waco, people still gathered each year on December 7th to tell the tale of the farm boy who became a symbol of strength. The Navy had honored him with the Navy Cross, yes, but even that didn't feel like enough. Over time, many began asking the same question. If Dorie Miller's actions weren't worth the Medal of Honor, what was? But bureaucracy and bias die slow deaths. For years, committees reviewed, delayed, or quietly declined to upgrade his award. Generations of veterans, historians, and civil rights advocates pushed, argued, and petitioned. Each time the effort was revived, it ran into another wall of red tape. Therefore, Dorie's name became something else. Not just a symbol of courage, but of the long, unfinished battle for recognition itself. Then, slowly, the tides began to turn again. The civil rights movement of the 1960s reignited interest in forgotten black heroes. Hollywood began revisiting World War II stories through new lenses. And as the internet age came, ordinary people rediscovered his story, sharing it, celebrating it, demanding it be told in full. But no revival would mean as much as what came in January 2020. That year, the U.S. Navy made a historic announcement. The next Gerald R. Ford-class aircraft carrier will be named the USS Dorie Miller. It would be the first aircraft carrier in U.S. history named after an enlisted sailor, and the first named after an African American. Therefore, nearly 80 years after Pearl Harbor, the Navy finally did what it couldn't in Dorie's lifetime: place his name among the giants. The ship's christening was more than symbolic. It was a rewriting of history. Admirals, veterans, and Miller's own family members stood at the ceremony, watching the massive hull of the USS Dorie Miller gleam in the sun, a ship that would one day sail the same oceans where he had fought and fallen. One speaker said, "This is not just a ship. It's a statement that valor knows no rank and heroism knows no color." But for those who truly knew his story, the meaning ran even deeper. Dorie Miller wasn't a man who sought attention. He was a humble sailor who wanted to serve his country, even when his country didn't serve him equally. Therefore, his legacy stands as a challenge: to never let bravery be measured by status, and to never let silence bury those who fought with honor. Today, students read his name in classrooms, sailors speak it with pride, and a new generation of Americans discover the man who redefined what courage looked like. He wasn't born a hero. He didn't wear a high rank. He had no weapon training, no privilege, no platform. But when the world was on fire, he stood his ground. He fought back. He saved lives. Therefore, his name, Dorie Miller, will forever stand not just as a war hero, but as a reminder of what happens when ordinary people refuse to stay ordinary. Because history doesn't remember titles. It remembers courage. History has a strange way of looping back, of resurrecting stories that once slipped through the cracks. For decades after his death, Dorie Miller was remembered mostly in small circles: veterans' halls, Texas classrooms and among families who knew what it meant to fight for a country that didn't always fight for them. But time, it seems, had bigger plans for Dorie's name. But in the 21st century, America began re-examining its heroes, asking not only who they were, but who had been forgotten. New documentaries emerged, historians dug deeper, and filmmakers started to see the cinematic power of Dorie's story. A young man born in segregation, denied training, yet choosing courage when chaos struck. Therefore, what once was a buried footnote began to rise again, this time not as a symbol of tragedy, but of transcendence. His story appeared in the 2001 film Pearl Harbor, where Cuba Gooding Jr. portrayed him. For many, that was the first time they ever heard his name. While the movie took creative liberties, the spirit of the man, calm, brave, and determined amid the storm, struck a chord worldwide. But movies fade. What mattered more was what his story sparked. Students began writing essays about him. Museums included him in exhibits about equality in the armed forces. Teachers used his story to show how true patriotism means standing tall even when no one is watching. Therefore, the legend of Dorie Miller evolved into something timeless. A story not just about war, but about human potential. His courage became a moral compass for generations who would never know the roar of torpedoes or the smoke of battle. They knew the feeling of being underestimated, overlooked, or dismissed, and they found in Dorie a mirror of quiet defiance. But the deeper his legacy spread, the clearer it became. Dorie Miller's story wasn't just about one act of heroism. It was about changing the narrative, about who gets to be remembered as a hero in the first place. Therefore, when the USS Doris Miller finally sails, it won't just carry aircraft or sailors. It will carry a legacy built on courage, humility, and an unbreakable belief that greatness can rise from anywhere, even from the galley of a segregated ship. The Navy now teaches his story as part of its heritage. Recruiters speak his name with pride, and for young black sailors stepping onto their first ship, Dorie isn't just a name from history. He's proof that their story, too, can change the course of the future. But perhaps the most powerful part of his legacy is how ordinary it was. Dorie wasn't superhuman. He didn't seek glory. He just saw chaos, and he acted. Therefore, when people today ask, what makes a hero? Dorie's story gives the simplest, truest answer. A hero is someone who does what's right, even when no one expects him to. 8 decades after Pearl Harbor, the ripples of his bravery still move through time, through classrooms, through ships, through the hearts of those who dare to believe that courage is not born, but chosen. He began as a farm boy from Waco. He died as a sailor lost at sea. And he lives on as a legend that refuses to fade. But maybe that's how true heroes live forever, not in marble statues or grand speeches, but in the moments when someone remembers their name and decides to be brave, too. Therefore, the story of Dorie Miller isn't just history. It's a promise that courage has no color, no rank, no limit. And as long as his story is told, the legend will never die.